All right, this begins our presentation on ethics. Now, ethics as it applies to public speaking is actually going to hit in a lot of different ways. Some of it will have to do with how you build the speech, some of it will have to do with how you deliver a speech and listen to one, and some of it will also have to do with simple ideas about what public speaking actually means for society. And that's actually where we're going to start. So, of course, the democratic principle of free speech is absolutely key. It's the idea that we have to be able to speak to each other, we have to be able to speak truth to power in order to actually make things better. That doesn't always mean that it has to be speaking out against injustice, although that's obviously one of the biggest implements of it. It also means just simple discussion and discourse of everyday things. We have to be able to talk freely and openly in order to make things move along better. But the problem is, as great as free speech is, there's a lot of things people tend to misunderstand about it. So that's what we're going to focus on. The textbook does a good job of talking about free speech on its own. I'd like to talk about some stuff that goes just beyond that. So, some common misconceptions about free speech. First, it's not unlimited. Now, the text hints at this but doesn't go into a whole lot of detail, but here are three key examples of how free speech is actually limited in certain ways and how we as a society are generally okay with these limitations. First, we're not allowed to use speech that is going to damage other people. The example here that you've probably heard before is to yell fire in a crowded theater, unless, of course, there actually is a fire. This type of speaking is limited because there's a potential to harm other people and it's based on untruth. Now, if there actually were a fire in the theater, obviously that'd be fine. The idea here is that speech can cause a ripple effect that could hurt other people. Now, this is usually very limited. The only time that we say these types of speech are outlawed is when there's actual physical harm involved. Another limitation, of course, is that we can't say things publicly that could hurt other people that are untrue. Slander and libel are two different examples of this. Slander is when you say things in public that could be defamatory to somebody else that are untrue, and libel is when you print them somewhere or publish them or put them onto the airwaves. Now, libel and slander are both really difficult to prove because a lot of problems come up when we have people who will generally provide information that has what are called weasel words. For example, if I say that Donald Trump is an alien from another planet, that's probably not true. I can't be totally certain, but I'm guessing it's not correct. But what if I said it this way? According to unknown sources or unnamed sources, Donald Trump is an alien from another planet. Now all I have to do is hide behind an infamous little shield, and that prevents me from being sued for libel. So this one tends to take a beating in public affairs, but it's still important to realize that we honor the idea behind it, that you shouldn't be allowed to say things about other people that are untrue if it will harm them. The final one is that we as a community generally have set up our own little age restrictions about the kind of content that can and should be shown in certain places. The classic example of this, of course, is the movies and how they are rated. They go through a pretty strict rubric. Now, there's been some controversy in recent years about how these ratings are actually addressed and who does the rating, but the idea of the rating is still fairly consistent. We also have this with video games, and even when there isn't an official rating, just think about basic topics that, say, for example, if you were turning on the TV on regular broadcast TV first thing in the morning, what kinds of things would you probably not expect to see? That's a restriction that we as a society generally are okay with. And they do change over time. One of my favorite examples of this is George Carlin, a famous comedian. One of his early bits that got him a lot of attention was the 7 words you can never say on television. And it's a list of 7 dirty words. The funny thing is that of those 7, several are now actually on television fairly frequently. Now, generally on cable, but some of them have snuck in. And that's because we as a society have changed our rules, our attitudes about those restrictions. One of my favorite examples of this is also that you'll notice that a lot of the restrictions will either focus on things that are gross, that is swear words having to do with like bodily functions, or we still have blasphemy laws basically. For example, the phrase Jesus Christ can be used on TV when it refers to the person. But when somebody actually throws that down as a swear, it generally isn't going to occur as often. So interesting how our culture tends to handle these things. Now, another misconception is that people are free of consequences. That is, if I say something out loud publicly and you hate me for it or argue that you don't come to my business as a result of it. That's not true. We are totally still open to the consequences. If I say something stupid and somebody else decides to not come to my business as a result of it, they're allowed to do so. I'm allowed to say it though. The government can't come and stop me from saying it. But that doesn't mean that my friends and relatives can't be kind of surprised that I would say it. Or, in another example, the stuff that we've been putting online for years and years, we're now raising the first generation that's basically lived their entire life online. And that means that a lot of the stuff that you've done and said probably are things that you wish could be removed. And that's why we're having increasing discussion about the right to be forgotten. Google, for example, has faced lawsuits in different countries around the world. And France has actually been one of the first to really push along a right to be forgotten, meaning that a person can't remove information from the internet, but they can lobby Google to make sure that that search result is not the top result when they search for something about the person. So you're allowed to say it, you're allowed to post it, but it might live out there for a pretty long time, so consequences do matter. Now, the third misconception is that a lot of people tend to think that they've got free speech and that's the moment at which their idea of free speech ends. That is, I can say something stupid, but the second you call me stupid for it, well, you're violating my rights. No, my right to say something stupid is equal to your right to call me stupid. So free speech does go both ways. This is something that actually was just talked about on The Daily Show with Fox News' Judge Napolitano, saying that the right to be offended doesn't exist. I've got the right to say things, and you've got the right to say things. And if what I say offends you, I'm allowed. Unless it violates one of those very clear restrictions listed under point number one, we're allowed to say those things. So be careful of overusing the idea of free speech if you don't fully understand what it means. And of course, this doesn't mean that anything you can say is something that you should say. And that's a different question of ethics. Now, your textbook addresses diversity several times in virtually every chapter, but this is one of the clearest examples of it, in which they take a section focusing on what happens when two cultures come into conflict. That is, when one ethical set of standards meets another ethical set of standards. And this is important for a public speaker to think about because it's not uncommon for us to make the mistake of assuming that every person in the audience is exactly the same as we are. This is something that we need to pay attention to when we look at how we engage in other cultures. Now, the first way that two cultures might engage is to assimilate, meaning that if you were to enter a larger culture, you would begin to take on the traits and characteristics and even ethical standards of that larger culture. This assimilation is usually something that we think of as the melting pot, but in recent years we've looked more at the idea of a salad bar, right? It's not that we melt all together and become one completely consistent type of material. Instead, it's that we all play along pretty well. We all play by the same set of general rules, even though we maintain our individual identity. A good example of this is that most first generation students have parents who really encourage them to learn English when they move to the United States, but the parents themselves might not. So notice that the assimilation is somewhat partial. And some parents will even really actively maintain a bilingual household so they can practice English and whatever their native language might be in order to maintain their personal identity while also trying to encourage their children to do better in school, to do better at assimilating to the larger cultural workforce. So assimilation doesn't mean that you sell out completely. It just means you try to find the ways that you can engage and connect to the culture at large. Now, the opposite of this would be resistance, meaning that when you hit that other culture, you would generally not take on the new roles. A good example of this happens to most Westerners when they go to Southeast Asia. In a lot of the bigger cities, the cities are so crowded that it's not uncommon to bump into each other. So the definitions of personal space tend to change a little bit. If you were to bump into somebody, even in a crowded city like New York, you would probably say, "Excuse me." But it's unlikely that that would happen if it were in Hong Kong. And that would be weird to you. You'd feel strange. You'd feel offended because someone who ran into you didn't apologize. Or if you bump into somebody and apologize, they would give you kind of a strange nonverbal response, and then that would offend you as well. So notice that you probably wouldn't change your own ethical standards. Your idea of, I bumped into you, therefore an apology must occur, is something you would probably cling to for a very long time, no matter how long you lived in China. So that resistance is one of the ways that we try to avoid, meaning you need to figure out ways to assimilate instead of resist. Now, if you can't assimilate completely, what you might find yourself doing is accommodation. And this is one of my favorite examples because it always makes me grin because of how it connects big business with religion. Now, a very long time ago, in fact, I'm willing to bet that some of your parents weren't even born during the time period in which this was still a rule. Christians were not allowed, Catholics in particular, were not allowed to eat meat on Friday. So instead, you would have fish. And you would notice that McDonald's and Burger King and any other place that had fast food would generally run special deals on those Fridays. Notice how they're not making any sudden accommodation. They were always selling the Filet-O-Fish sandwich. But on those Fridays, they would sell them at a cheaper rate, knowing that a lot of Christian families might want that choice. Now, the strange thing is, it continues to this day, even though the rules about fish on Friday have changed and most people don't observe them at all anymore, but you'll still see them. Even back when I was teaching at Seattle Pacific University, the soup on Friday was always clam chowder. They always made sure there was an option for people to handle this accommodation. So notice how they're not selling out. They're not becoming completely like the other, but they're aware of that other person's needs and making the accommodation for them. And that's kind of the key rule here. We're looking for civility. In order for this huge conglomeration of humans to get along, we have to be willing to give each other the benefit of the doubt. We have to be willing to assume that people aren't trying to hurt us, that when mistakes occur, they might be more likely to be misunderstandings than to be outright hate. Living in a pluralistic society demands that we have thick skin as well as kind words. And the reason why you need that thick skin is that a person might have said something to you that from their point of view was totally well-meaning, yet from your point of view was really offensive. We have to be willing to look past those things and try to give more people the benefit of the doubt. This has to do with both empathy and equality that are covered in your chapter. Empathy meaning that you have to understand where that other person might be coming from. One of my least favorite prejudices that I hear about all the time is how people are convinced that Asian drivers are bad. And the thing that most people don't pay attention to is that most first-generation drivers came to us from a city or country in which traffic wasn't anything like the traffic you see in the United States. So when they moved here, not only did they have to learn all of the things they had to learn to join our society, learning English, learning the new currency, etc., etc., but they also had to learn a new system of traffic. Now think back to your childhood. Every single time you ever got into a car, even if you weren't the one driving, you were the one who you were still able to pay attention to the rules of the road. You were still able to understand the feel and the flow of traffic. So you knew exactly how fast was too fast and where in the lane you were supposed to be and how often people use turn signals and when they used them. So all of that time you were in the car, even if you weren't the driver, you were training. You are becoming a part of that society. So when somebody comes here and might have a slightly different background, that might show up in bad driving behaviors. So remember, most people are probably trying as hard as they can. They're not out there to do it badly, and it's certainly not something genetic that's causing them to not drive as well, right? That's also the issue of equality. I'm willing to bet any of you who have actually done a study abroad or mission trip and have tried to drive a car in another country found out really quickly exactly how true what I just said was. Because in that other country, now you were the strange person. For example, a couple of friends of mine have both reported that when they went to Mexico City, the idea of using a turn signal, not really the idea. Instead, you would use your horn. If you needed to turn, you would honk your horn, and that would let people know that you're about to change the direction you're traveling. So think about that. You would feel really rude honking your horn all the time in America, but in Mexico City, it'd be what you would do just to get by. Now, this final slide is actually incredibly short because the chapter does a great job. The text gives an excellent discussion of this topic, including two things I want you to remember. One, there's several distinct types of plagiarism. When students that I've had in the past have plagiarized, one of the common confusions they had was that they thought that plagiarism meant either having somebody else write the whole paper, which is plagiarism, or stealing a whole paper, which is also plagiarism, or patchwork quotes, which is plagiarism. Or, wait a second, if I put it in my own words, how is that still plagiarism? Well, if you didn't give a citation, that's plagiarism. So notice there are several distinct types of plagiarism. The underlining key issue is always If you're presenting somebody else's ideas as your own, you're plagiarizing, and that's academic dishonesty. So when you get information from another source, even if you don't quote it word for word, you should always give us that source and let us know you got it from some other location. A good way to back yourself up in the future is, even though I require you to use the sources that you quote in your speech or that you actually refer to in your speech, if you do a bigger, more important presentation later on that includes research, you might want to include not only a works cited page, which means stuff you actually used, but even a works referenced page, meaning I might not have used this in my speech, but I did read it on the way to producing my speech. That way people know every single step you took along the way, and it totally covers you. The second issue they cover, of course, is the intentional versus unintentional plagiarism. And that's something, again, I like to try to give students the benefit of the doubt, that when I do catch cases of plagiarism, I usually assume a mistake has been made rather than somebody doing something insidious, unless there's clear evidence that the person is doing something tricky. So remember, it might be unintentional, so don't always pull the trigger and think this is the most terrible thing that ever happened. Allow for the possibility somebody might have made a mistake and allow them to walk back that mistake. Now, when you're working on your own speeches, especially these next two speeches that are due, when in doubt, always check with me. If you're not sure that the way you're using a source is correct, it's probably not. So be sure to check me and double check that particular issue. In many cases, my answer will be, hey, that thing you just told me, say that in the speech. For example, I had a student who had a great quotation, but it was a quote within a quote, meaning that the source that they read referred to another source, and they couldn't find that first source. What I told that student was, say that in your speech. Let the audience know that this is a quote within a quote, and that way you've covered yourself, and you've let people know exactly where you got the information from. So when in doubt, verify that stuff. So remember, this week we've got pushed up deadlines to allow for the 4th of July holiday. The discussion is due on Wednesday, same as always, and the quiz has been pushed up to Wednesday to get out of the way of the holiday. If you need extra time on the speech is due on Thursday, I'll allow that, but I wanted to give you that deadline to try to preserve your own weekend to make sure that you get that stuff done before you have fun this weekend. Take care, folks.